It was in these fields behind me that in the late afternoon of the 21st of September 1944 that the 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade would jump into the battle here at Arnhem. So the original intent of Sosabowski's 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade was to land on Drop Zone K, south of Arnhem Bridge on the 19th of September, take the southern end, and then help reinforce the men of the 1st Airborne Division who would have taken the northern end of the bridge on Sunday, the 17th of September 1944. However, as the situation developed, and Lieutenant Colonel Frost and his 2nd Battalion being the only battalion to make it to the northern end of the bridge, this information was relayed back to the United Kingdom, and as such the plan changed for Sosabowski and his men because of the delays in the weather, the worsening situation at the northern end of the bridge with Lieutenant Colonel Frost's eventual surrender to the Germans there on the 20th of September. The plan had to be altered quickly for Major-General Sosabowski's Polish paratroopers to land and support the rest of British 1st Airborne Division here at Arnhem. So the plan was put in place that Drop Zone K was moved, and it was moved here to Driel, knowing that the rest of the division had fallen back on the Oosterbeek pocket. With Driel being opposite Oosterbeek, it would provide the perfect location, utilising the ferry across the Nieder-Rhine to then allow the Polish paratroopers to head north across the river and reinforce Major General Urquhart's men of the 1st Airborne Division in the Oosterbeek perimeter until 30 Corps could make it there and relieve those forces. So after numerous cancellations, all due to bad weather, this was playing havoc with the Polish troops. They were keyed up for the fight. They hated the Germans, and all they wanted to do was exact revenge. And it's also important to remember at this very time that the Warsaw Uprising was occurring. And originally that was their intended mission, was to jump into Poland and help fight for the liberation of their country. However, as 1942 rolled into 43 and beyond, it soon became apparent that that wasn't likely to be the case. So the 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade was then attached to British 1st Airborne Division, and there was a lot of friction between Sosabowski and the Corps Commander Boy Browning. Now, Boy Browning is an interesting man, and he's probably one that's worth featuring in another episode, but I'm not a huge fan of his. Now, with Boy Browning being a typical former Guards officer and doing everything very much by the book, he and Sosabowski did not see eye to eye. And those scenes are famously depicted in the 1970s movie A Bridge Too Far. And you can see Gene Hackman's character as Sosabowski really pushing back against Boy Browning's kind of arrogant or air of arrogance that he displays in the briefing to the generals and then to the other officers that will be involved with the operation. And I like Sosabowski for that. He was a real soldier. He was a true soldier in the sense that he didn't suffer fools gladly, and he called out bad ideas when he saw them. And initially the Comet plan, which was the plan that preceded Market Garden, he really went against that. He then still protested Market Garden but felt it was a better plan. However, he was still adamant that there were a lot of areas of concern in it, and he riled against he went against the mainstream opinion. I respect that because he could probably see the areas where the British were just not prepared to acknowledge them. Now, while I acknowledge and respect Sosabowski's resistance against the plan and the fact that he was prepared to call out those above him when he saw bad ideas, it didn't do him any favours, and it certainly wouldn't post-war as well, and he was really made a scapegoat for some part of Operation Market Garden by Browning and Montgomery. But he would still jump into combat with his men and lead them from the front, and that, I think, is the mark of any good commanding general. So after all the delays, by the 21st of September, the 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade were boarding the aircraft in the early afternoon, and they were getting ready to make the drop onto Drop Zone K here at Driel. However, bad weather, even on the 21st of September, continued to plague the Poles. The planners realised that there was going to be bad weather on the return from the drop zones, so a recall message was sent out. Over 40 of the aircraft containing the whole of the 1st Battalion and elements of the 3rd Battalion turned back and landed at bases in England. One aircraft actually getting so lost it landed in Ireland. However, the rest of the Armada pushed on as they didn't receive the recall message due to the wrong codes being issued. As such, instead of there being a 1,600 strong force of Poles landing here at Driel, just over 1,000 landed here instead. Now the road I'm walking down here at the moment is on the southeasterly corner of Driel itself, and Sosabowski, upon landing, and the landing wasn't great, 5 men were killed due to German machine gun and mortar fire as they dropped onto what was a very hot drop zone, were killed, about 36 were injured. However, the rest of the men assembled quickly under an hour. So Sosabowski's mission here at Driel lay to the north of the town, and that was to capture the ferry that would then take them to Oosterbeek, enabling them to reinforce the men of the 1st Airborne Division that were surrounded in the perimeter there. In order for Sosabowski to make it to the north of Driel, to get to the ferry, he first had to establish a defensive perimeter here, knowing that the Germans occupying the southern bank of the Rhine were already here in great number. So the railway line that runs to the east of Driel, that was already full of Germans, and the Polish paratroopers here in the town were taking fire from there. So Sosabowski set up a defensive perimeter, and along this road was some of those positions guarding against further German attack. And one of those buildings that housed the Polish paratroopers was this set of buildings behind me. And this was where the Polish airborne engineers used during their time here in Driel as their headquarters. And it just so happens that this is the bed and breakfast that I'm staying at here during my time in Arnhem. This is the bed and breakfast where I'm staying, and this was used by the Polish airborne engineers during their time here in Driel. And I gotta admit, it's quite an honour to be staying here, knowing exactly what took place here 79 years ago. I'm now on the northern side of Driel, just on the southern side of the Nieder Rhine. Behind me on that high ground, that was German territory. That's across the Rhine, and that's heading in that direction towards Oosterbeek. This was Major-General Sosabowski's sort of initial objective here after securing the drop zone and moving off of there post the drop. He needed to come to this point here and try and secure the ferry crossing to enable his men to eventually head over the Rhine and help reinforce and bolster General Urquhart's 1st Airborne Division that were held up in the pocket in the perimeter at Oosterbeek. So the Poles, a lot like the 1st Airborne Division, were initially told to be very wary of the Dutch and not trust them, and that was from their intelligence reports that the 1st Airborne Division had of the locals here, but they were inaccurate. The Dutch were very keen to provide the Allies with as much useful information as possible. And upon landing, Sosabowski soon realised that actually they were very much friendly forces, and found that the ferry crossing here was no longer usable. So the ferryman who controlled the ferry here realised that there were Germans on that opposite bank of the Rhine. So he made the decision himself to prevent the ferry from falling into German hands and being used to cross the Rhine and to reinforce each north and south bank as required. He actually disabled it himself. Now clearly Sosabowski wouldn't have known this before dropping here, but when he got here and explained to the locals what his mission was, they informed him of that, and then that led Sosabowski to have to revisit all of his plans. Clearly for Sosabowski, he was left with little option at this point other than to dig in around Driel and hold that area and hope that more armoured support would come up from the south from 30 Corps in their push north. During this time, a small detachment of British armour did make it here, and they were eventually used to repel German armoured attacks here. Numerous discussions were held with the British forces that were coming up from the south in how they could possibly try and reinforce the northern bank, but none of it ever came to fruition. Eventually the men of the 1st Airborne Division, those that were able to, would then cross the Rhine from the north to the south side. But the actions of the Poles here at Driel wouldn't be for nothing. It was clearly apparent that the men of the 1st Airborne couldn't hold the perimeter at Oosterbeek. Something had to be done. So Operation Berlin was put into action on the night of the 25th through to the 26th of September 1944. Just under 2,400 men who were still physically able to, they made the crossing of the Rhine, and they were received by Allied troops here on the southern bank. And during this time, the Poles gave enough covering fire and helped support the operation to ensure that these men could escape. So this is the northern bank of the Nieder-Rhine. Behind me there in the distance is Oosterbeek Church, and that's where Major Lonsdale gave his famous speech to the men who had made it to this point. And now I am on the route that the 2,400 odd remaining soldiers from 1st Airborne took on the night of the 25th, 26th of September 1944 as part of Operation Berlin to evacuate from the north bank of the Nieder-Rhine all the way to the river itself, and then across the river to the south bank and back to friendly forces. For Operation Berlin, it was going to take place at night, obviously to try and use the cover of darkness as much as possible to conceal the soldiers' movements. They also as well had to wrap their ammo boots with cloth to try and dampen the noise that their hobnails, the steel pins that were on the underside of their boots, would make on the cobblestone so that the Germans couldn't hear them. Another aspect that went in favour of the men of the 1st Airborne Division on the night of the 25th of September during Operation Berlin were heavy storms and rainfall. It was also pitch black that night. All of these things helped to make their egress from the perimeter here at Oosterbeek down to the north bank of the Nieder-Rhine and across to safety that much easier for them. Now, the rescue attempt itself, crossing the river, was made possible by boats supplied by British and Canadian engineers, and they would ferry the men back and forth. There was also artillery from 30 Corps that had moved far enough up from Nijmegen, and they were able to support the operation by pouring in fire into suspected German positions on the northern bank to try and keep the Germans' heads down whilst the evacuation was taking place. Now, sadly, not all of the men who were trapped in the perimeter at Oosterbeek were able to be evacuated during Operation Berlin. These were the wounded and the medical staff from the Royal Army Medical Corps who stayed behind and tended to the wounded, knowing full well that they would all end up as prisoners of war at the hands of the Germans. So it was here on the northern bank of the Nieder-Rhine on the morning of the 26th of September 1944 in the early hours that many men who hadn't been able to make it across in the boats because that operation had ceased as day broke, that then attempted to swim the Rhine. And sadly, many of those young men drowned due to the fast-flowing waters of the river. So inside the church here at Driel, there's a wonderful visitor centre dedicated to the men of the 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade. So inside there's lots of information boards and tributes to the men of the 1st Independent Polish Parachute Brigade that fought here in Driel. And as you can see by looking around, the Poles of Driel are very much part of this town's story and are very much remembered here. So here in Driel, the Polish Paratroopers and their commanding officer, Major-General Stanisław Sosabowski, are honoured on just about every single street here. There are Polish airborne flags hanging from every lamppost and on all of the houses. And this beautiful memorial here to General Sosabowski himself is quite a special one. So his memorial was placed here, and it overlooks his former headquarters that he occupied during Operation Market Garden. And I think it's a wonderful tribute to this incredibly brave airborne warrior. As you can see, the Polish forces now here in Driel are commemorated, and they are exalted heroes of this town. Their memory here will never be forgotten. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of World War II Wayfinder, all about the Poles of Driel. I'll see you all in the next one.